When you start with a false premise, you end up with a false narrative. In any argument, discussion, or debate, the foundation of one's reasoning is critical. If the foundation is faulty, everything built upon it is bound to collapse under scrutiny. This is particularly true in the realm of premises and conclusions. When one starts with a false premise, they inevitably end up with a false narrative. The importance of starting with a sound premise cannot be overstated, as the consequences of flawed reasoning ripple outward, distorting reality and leading to misconceptions that can misguide personal beliefs and even societal movements. The nature of a false premise. A premise is the initial assumption or proposition upon which an argument is built. When this premise is incorrect or unsupported by evidence, it leads to flawed conclusions. As noted by philosopher Aristotle, a false premise leads to a false conclusion. This principle holds true across disciplines, whether in philosophy, science, theology, or politics. Consider a simple example in logic. If one begins with the premise, "all birds can fly," and proceeds to make conclusions based on this, they will inevitably encounter contradictions, such as encountering penguins or ostriches. The false premise sets the stage for a cascade of errors, forcing the person to either double down on faulty conclusions or reevaluate their starting point. The domino effect of a false narrative. Once a false premise takes root, it can develop into a broader false narrative, an overarching story that seems coherent but is built on shaky ground. These narratives can be especially dangerous because they often appeal to emotions, gaining widespread acceptance without critical examination. As the saying goes, a lie can travel halfway around the world, while the truth is still putting on its shoes. For instance, historical examples abound of how false premises can fuel damaging ideologies. In the early 20th century, the eugenics movement was based on the false premise that certain races or genetic traits were inherently superior to others. This premise led to horrific conclusions, including forced sterilizations and genocidal policies. Though completely disproven by modern genetics and biology, the false narrative caused untold suffering because it was allowed to flourish unchecked for years. Another example can be seen in modern politics. Suppose one starts with the premise that inflation is solely caused by corporate greed, a narrative that's been propagated by some political figures. Based on this premise, one might propose superficial solutions such as price controls or increased regulation on businesses, rather than addressing the more complex underlying causes such as supply chain disruptions, government spending, and monetary policy. As former U.S. President Ronald Reagan once said, "The most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government, and I'm here to help.'" A misdiagnosis of the problem, built on a false premise, leads to policies that can exacerbate the issue rather than solve it. The dangers of confirmation. Bias. One of the reasons false premises are so pernicious is that they feed into confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out information that supports one's pre-existing beliefs. When someone is committed to a false premise, they will often ignore or distort evidence that contradicts it, further entrenching themselves in a false narrative. As Carl Sagan pointed out, the fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus, they laughed at Fulton, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. Sagan's remark underscores the danger of clinging to a belief simply because it aligns with one's worldview, rather than rigorously testing the premise upon which it stands. The importance of rigorous examination. The antidote to the false premise, false narrative trap is critical thinking and a commitment to rigorous examination of the foundations of one's beliefs. Before accepting a conclusion, one must ask, what are the premises? Are they supported by evidence? Do they withstand scrutiny from multiple angles? Albert Einstein famously said, "Unthinking respect for authority is the greatest enemy of truth." In other words, accepting premises or conclusions without question, simply because they come from an authoritative or popular source, can lead to the perpetuation of false narratives. The only way to avoid this is by questioning assumptions, seeking out contradictory evidence, and being willing to revise one's beliefs when the premises are proven wrong. Conclusion. When we start with a false premise, we are doomed to end up with a false narrative. Whether in personal decision-making, public policy, or intellectual discourse, the accuracy of our premises directly influences the truth of our conclusions. The best safeguard against this pitfall is a commitment to evidence, a willingness to question our assumptions, and the humility to acknowledge when we've been wrong. By doing so, we can protect ourselves and society at large from the dangerous consequences of false narratives built on shaky foundations.